Good to see you again. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and activate the bell for more videos. There are stories that begin with love at first sight. And then there are stories that begin before the first sight ever happens, long before two souls meet, long before they even know they're searching for each other. This is one of those stories. In a quiet part of the city, tucked between rows of aging buildings and ivy-covered balconies, lived a man named simply by his passion, the painter. Few knew his name, even fewer had stepped inside his apartment. And yet, every evening, the scent of oil, paints, and turpentine would drift from his open window, carried by the wind like whispers from another world. He lived alone, not because he feared love or disliked company, but because his world was already full of a presence only he could feel, a presence that came in the quiet of night, with eyes that haunted his dreams and a voice he had never actually heard. She was beautiful, not in the way magazines define beauty, but in the way one remembers someone they've never met. Vivid, familiar, eternal. Her features would change slightly each time he dreamt of her. Sometimes her hair was long and dark, other times it shimmered in the morning light. But the eyes never changed. They always carried the same expression, a blend of longing and sorrow, as if she had something to say, but the dream never lasted long enough for her to speak. For years, he painted her, canvas after canvas, always starting with the same outline, always chasing the same face. But he never finished a single portrait, not one. The moment he tried to bring her fully to life, when he'd reach her eyes, or the final touch on her smile, his hand would freeze. His brush would tremble. Something in him would whisper, "Not yet." He didn't know why. All he knew was that she wasn't just a figure in his mind. She meant something. She was someone. But who? Where did she come from? Why had she chosen him? His friends thought he was eccentric. Some whispered that he had grown too isolated. Others joked that he was in love with a ghost. He didn't argue. Maybe they were right. But he couldn't stop. The dreams didn't stop. The feeling didn't fade. And every time he closed his eyes, there she was waiting. Time passed. Seasons changed. The world outside kept spinning. But inside his apartment, the painter remained locked in a loop. A cycle of dreams and unfinished canvases. He had long ago stopped trying to explain it. He just painted, as if by painting, he might one day unlock the mystery. Until the day everything changed. It was a Monday morning, the kind of morning that goes unnoticed. Gray skies, a breeze that smelled of rain, the kind of day that people rush through. But something about that morning was different. Though he didn't know it yet. He was in his studio, standing in front of a new canvas, attempting once again to capture her. The dream from the night before had been unusually vivid. He had seen her standing in a garden, surrounded by white roses. She had turned to look at him, really look at him. And just before the dream faded, she reached out her hand. He had woken with his heart racing, and now here he was, brush in hand, trying to replicate the moment. Then, a noise. Voices from the hallway, footsteps, a door slamming. Next door, the apartment that had been vacant for months. New neighbors, perhaps. He didn't think much of it. But something tugged at him. A subtle feeling, like the air had shifted. A new presence had arrived. Something familiar. He shook it off. But that night, the dream returned. She was there again. But this Chimi, she wasn't standing in a distant field or fading into shadows. She was close, closer than ever. He could see the texture of her skin, the gentle curve of her cheek, the light in her eyes. She reached for him again, and this Chimi he reached back. Their fingers nearly touched. Then he woke up. He sat upright in bed, breathless, sweat glistening on his brow. He had never felt anything like it before. It wasn't just a dream. It was a message. The next day, something even stranger happened. While taking out the trash, he caught a glimpse of someone entering the building next door. A woman. Not just any woman. She had dark hair tied loosely, carried an armful of architectural blueprints, and wore a scarf that fluttered in the wind like it was trying to get his attention. He didn't see her face clearly, but the feeling returned. That same strange flutter in his chest, that same quiet voice in his mind whispering, her. He tried to ignore it. Coincidences happen all the time, he told himself, but something inside him refused to let go. That night, he painted feverishly, desperately. The face in his dream had never been clearer, and for the first time in years, his hand didn't hesitate. He painted late into the night, eyes burning, fingers stained in color. When he finally stopped, he looked at the canvas and his heart almost stopped. She was there, fully formed, complete, everything except the eyes. He couldn't finish them, not yet. And deep down, he knew why. Because this time, it wasn't a face from a dream. It was someone real, someone close, someone next door. Days passed. He started noticing small things. A light turning on at exactly 6 p.m. next door. The sound of jazz floating from the neighboring balcony on Sunday mornings. The faint smell of coffee and cinnamon drifting through the walls. She was Heao. He had to meet her. But how? He wasn't good with people. Conversations tangled in his throat. His art spoke louder than his words ever could. So he waited. Waited for fate to intervene once again. And one day, it did. A forgotten umbrella. A shared elevator ride. A clumsy introduction. And then she saw the painting. She stepped into his studio, eyes wandering across the half-finished pieces, until she stopped in front of the canvas. Her mouth fell open. Her breath caught, because she recognized it, recognized herself. But how? They had never met before. Had they? And so begins the real mystery. The moment where dreams, memories, and lives intersect. The moment when what feels impossible becomes undeniable. Because sometimes love doesn't begin in the present. Sometimes it begins in the spaces between dreams and reality. And sometimes a portrait, though unfinished, is only waiting for the right soul to complete it. Every story has a turning point, a moment so subtle you might miss it, yet so powerful that once it happens, nothing remains the same. For the painter, that moment had a face, a real face, no longer just a vision from his dreams, but someone who lived and breathed right next door. Her name, he didn't know it yet, but she had arrived, and her arrival would begin to unravel the mystery that had haunted him for years. She moved in quietly, without fanfare. No loud moving trucks. No noise. Just a few boxers, a tired smile, and a sketchpad under one arm. A young architect, returning to the city after years away, seeking a new beginning in a building that seemed to call her back. It wasn't the most glamorous place, aging bricks, rusted balconies, peeling hallways, but something about it felt familiar. She couldn't explain it. From the moment she stepped inside, it felt like she'd been there before. Like the creaks in the wooden floor whispered old stories. Like the walls carried echoes of a forgotten life. She chose the apartment next to the painter's studio. She didn't know who lived there. Just that soft music sometimes drifted through the walls. And once, the scent of lavender and linseed oil lingered in the hallway. She liked it. It reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. She was not the kind of woman who believed in destiny. She believed in structure, blueprints, and lines that made sense. Her life was defined by order, projects, schedules, precision. But even she couldn't deny that something about this place was different. There were dreams, strange ones. The first night in her new apartment, she dreamt of a man's voice, low, gentle, humming an old melody she didn't recognize. She dreamt of standing in a garden of white roses, reaching out to someone she couldn't see. She woke up, confused, heart racing. Then the dreams came again. Each night, more vivid, a piano playing in the distance. The feeling of paint on her skin, a room filled with canvases, and always the same pair of eyes watching her with a love that felt impossibly familiar. She didn't tell anyone. Who could she tell? She chalked it up to stress, to the exhaustion of moving. But the dreams wouldn't stop, and neither would the strange sense that something was waiting for her. They met by accident. A forgotten umbrella. It was a rainy afternoon. She had just returned from a site visit, soaked from head to toe, cursing herself for not checking the weather app. As she reached her door, she saw a small, old umbrella leaning against the wall. She picked it up, and before she could knock next door, the door opened. He stood there. The painter, disheveled, quiet, his eyes intense yet kind. He opened his mouth to speak, but for a sec, no words came. He simply stared, because it was her, not just someone who looked like the woman from his dreams. It was her. He felt it. And though she didn't know why, she felt it too. There was a stillness between them, a recognition deeper than memory, as if time itself paused for a brief moment just to breathe. She handed him the umbrella, made a shy comment about the rain. He thanked her softly, and then she saw the open door behind him, and inside, canvases. So many canvases. But one stood out. Leaning against the wall, still drying, was the painting. Her painting. She stepped forward instinctively, not out of curiosity, but something else, compulsion, maybe. A sense of inevitability. Her breath caught because there it was, her face, perfectly captured. Every detail, every shade, every emotion. Even the little scar near her eyebrow she'd gotten when she was 5 and fell from her bike. Even the way her hair curled slightly behind her ears when it rained. It wasn't just similar. It was her. She turned to him, eyes wide. Where did you see this? she asked, voice trembling. He looked at her, barely able to answer. I've been painting you, he said. For years. She blinked. But we've never met. He nodded slowly. I know. They sat for hours. He made coffee, she dried her coat, and slowly they began to speak about the painting, the dreams, the strange coincidences that felt less like accidents and more like puzzle pieces clicking into place. She confessed her recent dreams. The garden, the music, the same reaching hand. He listened, silently, his heart beating louder with every word, because he had dreamt the same things at the same time. They didn't say the word aloud, not yet. Not reincarnation, not destiny, not past lives. It felt too big, too unreal, but something inside them both already knew. In the weeks that followed, they grew closer. Coffee turned into long conversation. He showed her his work, his studio now filled with variations of her over the years, some sad, some smiling, some unfinished. She showed him her designs, buildings she'd never seen, places she didn't remember, yet somehow recognized in his paintings. They began to notice small things. They reached for the same teacup. They shared favorite colors, favorite books, even a deep, irrational fear of drowning that neither could explain. Sometimes they would sit together in silence, listening to the rain, and feel like they were remembering something instead of living it for the first time. She started to wonder, had they known each other before? Had their souls touched in another lifetime? One night, he asked her to pose, to finish the portrait. She hesitated but agreed. As she sat in front of the easel, his hands trembled. He picked up the brush, looked into her eyes, and for the first time in years, he painted without fear. On this chimney, he painted her eyes. When he was done, they stared at the canvas together. It was complete, truly complete. But more than that, something had shifted. She touched the canvas gently, then turned to him. I don't know how to explain any of this, she whispered, but it feels like I've found something I've been searching for. He nodded. I think we both have. Sometimes the past doesn't stay in the past. Sometimes love doesn't wait for logic or time or permission. Sometimes it finds its way through paint, through dreams, through rain-soaked umbrellas and open doors. She was no longer just the woman in his dreams. She was the woman next door, but she was also something more, something timeless, something eternal, and their story was just beginning. Some discoveries change everything. They don't come with fireworks or a sudden crash of thunder. They arrive quietly, in a breath, in a look, in a moment when time no longer behaves the way it should. For her, it came the day she stepped into his studio and saw the canvas. She had no way of preparing for it. Because how do you explain seeing your own face, staring back at you from a painting? Not a painting done after meeting her. Not something created with her as a model, but a face painted long before they had ever exchanged a word. A portrait built from dreams and memory. A version of her that shouldn't exist. And yet, there it was. She didn't just see the resemblance. She knew it was her. Not a copy, not an interpretation, Baha. And something inside her stirred, not confusion. Recognition. That moment frozen between the canvas and reality felt like falling into two timelines at once. One part of her stood in the present, confused, stunned. The other part remembered. She didn't know what exactly she remembered, only that her body did, her heart did. Some part of her deeper than thought itself whispered, "I've seen this before." He stood behind her, silent, watching her reaction, not with pride, but with reverence. As if this moment had been years in the making. As if this exact second was the final stroke in a painting that had lived in his heart far longer than any canvas. She reached out to touch the artwork. Her fingers hovered just above the painted lips, then slowly moved to the eyes. The eyes. That's where it hit her hardest, because those were not just her esti, were her emotions. There was something in them she'd never seen in a mirror, but instantly understood. A longing, a knowing, a sorrow wrapped in love. It was like looking into her own soul but from someone else's memory. "How is this possible?" she whispered. He shook his head. "I've been asking myself that for years." And then the silence between them deepened. Not awkward, not empty. It was the silence of comprehension, of two lives aligning, of two people standing at the center of a mystery. Neither could fully explain yet, neither could deny. Later that evening, she sat in his studio, eyes still drawn to the painting as he made tea in the background. She traced the soft edges of the room with her gaze. Old books, paint brushes, jars of pigments, sunlight slanting through dusty windows. A world built by someone who didn't need the outside to feel full because his inside world overflowed. "I don't understand it," she said, finally breaking the quiet. "I've never modeled. I've never even met you before last week." "I know," he said softly, handing her the cup. "And yet, I've been seeing you in dreams for years." She looked up. "Dreams," he nodded. "Always the same woman, always just out of reach. I've never seen her face clearly. Until recently, until just before you moved in." Her breath caught. "Have you ever?" She hesitated, then leaned forward. "Have you ever felt like you were remembering something that never happened?" "Yes," he said without blinking. "Every time I pick up a brush." She stared at him, as though trying to decipher whether this was madness or something more, something bigger, something sacred. And then, as if compelled by instinct, she pulled out her "Can I show you something?" He nodded. She flipped through pages of architectural designs, clean lines, sketches of buildings. Then, near the back, were images that didn't fit the rest. Drawings she barely remembered doing. A crumbling fountain, a Hosigardaman Aranizio, a house by a river. None of them were real places. Not to her. Anyway, but as he saw them, his hands began to shake. "These," he whispered, "these are from my dreams." She looked at him, startled. "I never told anyone," she said. "I didn't even think about it. I just drew them when I couldn't sleep." They sat in silence, the sketchpad open between them, as if it were a portal, as if they had both been walking toward this very moment from opposite ends of a forgotten life. The days that followed were like walking through fog lit by golden light. They began meeting almost daily, sometimes with reason, sometimes without. A borrowed book, a question about a blueprint, a shared lunch on the rooftop. And yet, every conversation slipped into something deeper. Philosophy, time, memory, destiny. One afternoon, she asked him if he believed in past lives. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a bundle of old paintings ones he never displayed. Images of places he didn't know, faces of people he couldn't name. But she could. She pointed to one of the backgrounds. "That's the fountain I sketched. I've never seen it before in real life." He showed her a painting of a woman in a garden, dressed in clothing centuries out of date. She whispered, "That's me." And he nodded, because he already knew. There was a moment just before sunset, one evening, when they stood on the balcony together, drinks in hand, watching the sky turn pink and gold. The city below was bustling, but up there, time had stopped. "I feel like we're remembering the same story," she said, not looking at him, but from different pages. He turned to her, heart racing. What if it's the same story, told again? They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to, because in that silence, something passed between them. A confirmation, a knowing, whatever this was. It was more than coincidence. It was more than dreams. It was more than chemistry or curiosity or even love. It was something ancient, a continuation. And the painting, it stayed in the studio, no longer a mystery to him, but not fully understood either. Now, when she looked at it, she no longer saw confusion. She saw closure, a connection across lifetimes, a message sent forward through time by a soul that refused to forget. They didn't need answers anymore. Not right away. Some truths reveal themselves not in logic, but in layers and in brushstrokes, in lines on a canvas, in the simple, stunning fact that a face once imagined could step into the real world, smile, and say, "I'm here now." Sometimes, memories arrive uninvited. They come like shadows at dusk's off, unclear but impossible to ignore. For her, the memories began not in childhood, but in adulthood. Strange flickers, fragments that didn't fit her life. It started with a smell, the scent of old paper, of a forgotten garden, of rain on stone steps. It would hit her unexpectedly in the elevator. On the street while washing dishes, suddenly she'd be somewhere else. Not in her apartment, not in this time, in another place, another life. She would close her eyes and images flooded her mind. A house with peeling blue paint, a violin playing in the distance, a woman standing by a window, watching a storm roll in. She tried to ignore these feelings at first, told herself they were just stress or imagination, but the memories grew stronger, not like dreams, not like fantasies. They felt real. One evening, after a long day at work, she sat on the balcony, staring at the city lights. Suddenly, a vision took hold. She saw herself not as she was now, but as someone else. A woman from centuries ago. She felt the fabric of a dress sliding across her skin, the weight of a necklace around her neck, the ache of waiting for someone who never came. Tears came without warning. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew it wasn't madness. It was something else. The painter noticed the change in her, the quiet moments of distraction, the way her eyes sometimes looked distant, lost. One afternoon, as they sat in the studio, surrounded by unfinished canvases, he reached out gently. "Tell me," he said softly, "what are you feeling?" She hesitated, then spoke of the visions, of memories that weren't hers, of feelings that didn't belong to her present life. He listened, and then shared his own story. How the woman in his dreams had never been just a figment of imagination, but a whisper from another time. How his art was a bridge between what was and what could be. How he believed that some souls were bound together across lifetimes, carrying pieces of each other's histories. Together, they began to explore these memories, digging through old books, photographs, and records, visiting places that stirred something deep inside them both. One day, in an old library, they discovered a faded diary written by a woman whose description matched to the face in the painting perfectly. The diary spoke of love, loss, and promises made under a willow tree. Reading those words, she felt a connection, a story that belonged to her, but also to someone else. As the memories grew clearer, they realized something incredible. They were not just two strangers. They were echoes of a story unfinished. A love paused, waiting to be completed. In the stillness of the studio, surrounded by brushstrokes and whispered histories, they understood. Some memories live beyond time. Some loves transcend lifetimes. And some portraits know, matter how unfinished, hold the key to unlocking forgotten souls. There are moments that don't belong to time. Moments when something ancient pulses inside the present. When two hearts beat, not as strangers meeting for the first time, but as souls reuniting, continuing a story that never truly ended. For them, it began with a painting, a dream, a face. But now, it was more than that. It was memory, emotion, evidence, and the growing, undeniable truth that what tied them together went beyond coincidence, beyond imagination, beyond this life. She had started dreaming in sequences, not symbols, not metaphors, but scenes clear, visceral, emotional, a wedding veil drifting through wind, a man in uniform boarding a train, turning back with tears in his eyes, a letter stained in ink and heartbreak, and then a fire. Always a fire. She would wake with her heart racing, hands trembling, the scent of smoke clinging to her like fog that refused to lift. But each time, it felt less like fiction and more like memory, like something that had really happened. The painter, too, had begun seeing clearer visions. He no longer dreamt in fragments, but in full chapters. He saw her dressed in 1800s lace, reaching for him across a ballroom. He saw himself folder, hands shaking, painting her as she stood by a window waiting for news of a war he would not return from. Every brushstroke he made now carried weight. His art had become more than expression. It was reconstruction of a love that spanned lifetimes. They began journaling everything. They compared dreams, mapped dates, described people and places they had never visited in this life, but somehow recognized down to the smallest detail. One evening, over candlelight and scattered notebooks, she whispered, "What if we've always found each other in every life?" He looked at her, not with surprise, but with certainty. "I think we have," he said. "And I think every time something tries to keep us apart." She nodded slowly, voice trembling. "But maybe this time we get it right." Together, they traveled to a small village by the coast, compelled by a location she had seen in a recurring dream. A lighthouse perched above a jagged cliff. She had drawn it once without understanding why. As they stood before it in real life, she burst into tears. Because it was exactly as she remembered. Not imagined, remembered every stone, every wave, even the old bench overlooking the sea. She sat there, hand in his, and closed her eyes. Suddenly, she could hear herself from another life, singing softly into the wind, waiting for him to return from across the ocean. It was the same bench where she had once waited until she didn't anymore, where she had promised, if not this life, then the next. He knelt beside her, silent, and in that moment, neither of them questioned it anymore. This wasn't madness. This wasn't fiction. It was the truth. They had always known but never dared to say aloud. They had found each other again. Not by chance, but by design. Back in the city, the portrait took on new meaning. It no longer represented mystery or longing. Now it held clarity, completion. But strangely, the painter couldn't bring himself to sign it, not yet, because something told him the story wasn't quite finished. There was one last moment yet to come. Then, one night just before midnight, she knocked on his door, her eyes with the hinge trembling, and in her palm a pendant. Not old, not expensive, but instantly recognizable. It was the same pendant worn by the woman in his 19th century painting, the same one she had drawn as a child, with no idea where the image had come from. "I found it in a box at my grandmother's house," she said, breathless. No one knew who it belonged to. He held it in his hand, speechless. It was hers, from a lifetime ago, now returned to her. In this one, they sat beneath the studio skylight that night, holding the pendant, holding each other, and letting the silence speak what words could not, because they both finally understood the painting wasn't just a portrait. It was a promise, a vow carried across time, across memory centuries. I will find you no matter how long it takes. Love, real love, the kind that defies logic, and death doesn't always need explanation. Sometimes it just is unmistakable, unshakable, unfinished, until the souls involved are brave enough to recognize it again. They had walked through different lives, different bodies, different fates, but somehow, across the chaos of lifetimes, they found each other, not through searching, but through remembering. Because some connections don't begin in this world. They simply continue here. And this Chimi, they would choose each other, fully, finally, forever. There comes a moment in every story, a final scene, a closing line, a last note held just long enough to echo into silence. For them, it began with a painting, a dream, a mystery, but now everything had changed. The questions that haunted them no longer needed answers, not because they were solved in the traditional sense, but because they had lived their way through them. And now only one thing remained unfinished, one final brushstroke. The painting still stood on the easel in his studio, lit by morning sun, kissed by dust and time. Her face, delicate and strong, captured with breathtaking clarity, but something was still missing. Not from the canvas, but from him. The painter had spent years trying to complete this work, not knowing who she was, not knowing why she came to him in dreams, not knowing what he was really painting. But now he knew. It wasn't just her face. It was their story. Every color, every shadow, every line. They weren't just art. They were memory. They were love that refused to die. They were a record of every life they had shared, every time they found each other again, and every time they were torn apart. Except this time, they weren't. This time, they had stayed. That morning, she entered the studio quietly. She stood behind him just as he dipped the brush into paint. He turned, and their eyes met. No hesitation, no fear, no more wondering if this was real. It was, and it had always been. She reached out and gently touched his hand. He looked at her, smiled softly, and whispered, "Are you ready?" She nodded, and together they stepped toward the canvas. He raised the brush, paused, then, with her hand resting over his, he added a single, final stroke. One line, one flick of color, and it was done. The portrait was complete, fully, finally, completely alive. But it wasn't just a painting anymore. It was the physical manifestation of a love that had refused to be forgotten, of souls that had waited through centuries just to find this moment. The final brushstroke wasn't just the end of a painting. It was the beginning of a life remembered, lived, and now continued. In the days that followed, they stopped searching for signs. They no longer needed to look to the past for validation because they had brought the past into the present. And more importantly, they had claimed the present as their own. They made new memories, wrote new chapters, laughed over coffee, and cried over movies. They built a life together, ordinary and extraordinary, at the same time. Because this time, they didn't have to say goodbye. One afternoon, while organizing old sketchbooks, she found something tucked behind the pages, a note, faded, handwritten. It wasn't hers. It wasn't recent. It simply read, "If we forget, may the stars remind us." She brought it to him. Neither recognized the handwriting, but both knew it was from another life, a message they had once left for themselves. To remember, to keep going, to find one another again. She placed the note in a frame and hung it beside the painting. It was a reminder not of what they had lost, but of what they had survived. Years passed, the painting remained on the studio wall. People would come and go, some moved by it, others curious about the story behind it. They never gave too many details. How could they? How could they explain that the painting wasn't about technique or talent, but about truth? That it was a door through time, a mirror for the soul, that it held within it lifetimes of longing, of promise, of return. No, they didn't try to explain it. They just lived quietly, deeply, gratefully, together. One evening, long after the sun had set and the city lights blinked into gold beneath the skyline, they stood before the portrait again. Older now, softer in the eyes, still as deeply connected as they had been the first moment they touched. He looked at her and smiled. "You know," he said, "I used to think I was painting someone who didn't exist." She turned to him, eyes glistening. "And now," he paused, gently taking her hand, "now I know. I was painting the only person who's ever truly been real to me." She leaned into him. They stayed like that for a long time. No need to speak, no need to explain, because some love stories don't end. They don't fade. They don't dissolve with time. They wait. They return. They endure. And when the final brushstroke is placed, they begin again. The end. Or perhaps the beginning.